I wanted to welcome Ken Alex tonight and thank you for coming and agreeing to be recorded. Ken got a BA in political theory from University of California, Santa Cruz, and went on to get a law degree from Harvard. Worked for a number of years at the California Attorney General's office, heading the environmental section there, and then went on to work under Jerry Brown as a senior policy advisor to the governor on the Office of Planning and Research and chair of the Strategic Growth Council, focusing on climate, energy, environment, and land use issues. And now, for a number of years, has been the director of Project Climate at the University of California, Berkeley's Center for Law, Energy, and Environment, focusing on the most promising climate solutions and moving them more quickly to policy and scale, including responses from the current federal attack on climate change action. Um, I'm going to go ahead and skip the native land acknowledgement, but we normally do that. We're conscious of that, Ken, and it's the Abenaki tribes that were in this land in New Hampshire before the colonists came. So thank you. Emily, what is the slide sharing option up? So you can go ahead and share your screen if you'd like, Ken.
Sure. Let's see. Huh, there we go. Okay, you can hear me, I take it?
Yes, thank you.
All right, well, thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. I guess I'm on a lonely land here in the other side of the country. So I want to talk today about Project 2025, something of an update, as well as a review of where we are with Project 2025. It's sort of impressive, I have to say, how much of Project 2025 on the environmental front has already been moved forward by the Trump administration. So, of course, I focus primarily on environment. Project 2025 is 900 pages, and it covers a lot of topics in addition to environment. So my focus is really in the environmental pieces of it. So I'll talk through some of that. I want to talk about some of the general themes in Project 2025, some of the actions at the agency level. And then I want to talk specifically about 4 actions that were proposed by Project 2025 and pursued very aggressively to this point by the Trump administration. Now, all of this is in process. Meaning that just because action has been taken doesn't mean it's the final word. And of course, there's lots of litigation. And so I'll be talking to some extent about the legal issues around some of this as well. And any questions that people have more broadly about some of the legal actions involving the Trump administration, I'm a lawyer and I will do my best to try to answer that as well. So let's see here. So there are quite a few themes in Project 2025. In the environment portion of the document, which is quite a bit of it, these are some of the main ones, and they will not surprise you. There's a very strong theme of climate change denial, called climate change fanaticism in the document quite a bit, and really a complete disregard for the science of climate change. And by the same token, the flip side of that is that it is unequivocally and unapologetically and a fossil fuel agenda promoting oil, gas, and coal, and not reflecting any of the impacts of fossil fuels in any way. Not surprisingly, the answer in Project 2025 to energy issues is oil and gas and coal. And anything having to do with renewables is seen as fanaticism. And we've, of course, seen those as major themes in the first 6 months of the Trump administration. Throughout the document, getting rid of US EPA, or at least gutting it, is a major theme. And again, we've seen that in the Trump administration. The Project 2025 response to regulations is that regulations are bad and should be gotten rid of, with certain exceptions, those that promote oil and gas, for example. And one of the most concerning aspects of Project 2025 that we've seen repeatedly in the Trump administration is to really undermine science. And obviously, in the healthcare world, that has been a major theme of the Trump administration. It's the same in the environment area. And unfortunately, the Trump administration has been very effective in undermining science and disputing science and really walking away from the best science. The two things that, even with all of that, that I think are most concerning in the medium and longer term is the effort to undo the civil service system of the federal government. And I will talk about that at some length in a bit. And then also to walk away from the incredibly important work that the federal government has done in terms of gathering data and being repository of data, because of course that supports good science. And it's a worldwide set of data on not just climate, but all aspects of science that really the federal government has historically been the most important repository, and now that's no longer the case. So these are all themes that run through Project 2025 that in the first 6 months of the Trump administration have already made a pretty big impact. And we can see that Project 2025 is the blueprint for a lot of these actions. So some quick examples. Many of these I think you know, but just to run through them quickly. Project 2025 focuses on many agencies, but among them is the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, which includes the National Weather Service. It's sort of beyond comprehension why they would want to get rid of the National Weather Service, but they have significantly gutted it and reduced its availability to do weather forecasting, hurricane forecasting, drought and flooding forecasts, etc. I think it's an effort to privatize. And then NOAA, which is the agency that includes the Weather Service, is very important for many aspects of science, but certainly for climate change, because it focuses on the impacts of things like acidification of the ocean and other aspects of atmospheric and oceanographic impacts. So unfortunately, those agencies have been severely undermined, and consistent with Project 2025. USAID has been in the news quite a bit. It is a one of the very top focuses of Project 2025, not surprisingly, given what the Trump administration has been doing. And part of that is because it is perceived to promote climate smart development around the world. It does many other things as well, or used to, in terms of foreign aid that you're more familiar with than I, particularly around health issues in developing countries and underserved areas. But it is a major target because it's perceived to promote concepts that Project 2025 authors do not support. Project 2025 pursues the idea of getting rid of the Inflation Reduction Act entirely. It seemed for a while that the Trump administration would keep some of it because so much of the IRA funds work in red states, particularly around renewables. But as we can see from the Senate and House versions of the proposed budget, the IRA is not going to survive, or does not look likely to survive, and that's right out of the pages of Project 2025. To a lesser extent, they're also cutting back on the BIA, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, although some of that does appear to be continuing to be funded. And then there are some additional proposals in Project 2025 that I have to say are a little surprising. But the Trump administration is following through on the proposals. The first is opposition to upgrading the electric grid. And I think a lot of that is that the upgrades to the grid are proposed in conjunction with renewable energy. And so this is this opposition to renewable energy, which is truly bizarre. And I think most people in the country, if they understand it, are opposed to what Project 2025 is suggesting and what the Trump administration is doing. And the one that really is bizarre is an absolute opposition to appliance efficiency standards that has saved the country really hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars. So just to use California as an example, Governor Jerry Brown, when he was first governor, he was the youngest governor in California in the 1970s and the oldest governor in California in the 2010s. He promoted and passed some of the original appliance efficiency standards in the country. And the result of that was California's electricity bills, even though the rates in California have been quite high, the bills themselves have been much lower because the appliances in California use less electricity. But apparently any regulation along those lines that tells manufacturers what to do is something that Project 2025 and now the Trump administration strongly oppose. So very strange, but there we are. Now, let me see if okay. So I want to talk very briefly about some of the proposals in Project 2025 for various other agencies that don't get as much attention. So for agriculture, the Department of Agriculture, Project 2025 says environmental issues are ancillary to agricultural production. I think that any farmer in America would be surprised to hear that, given that they have to deal with the environment on a daily basis. But the idea and the proposal for Project 2025 is to end conservation funding, which is a pretty significant part of the Department of Agriculture budget. And then Department of Agriculture also includes the forestry. And their Project 2025 proposes that the solution is to cut more trees. I think we're more affected by that in the West. And there is some agreement that there should be some additional and careful forestry practices that include tree harvesting. But of course, Project 2025 takes it in a direction that supports things like clear cutting, which has long been determined to not be beneficial to forests. So Department of Energy is a particular target of Project 2025 and the Trump administration. There's promotion of the idea of oil and gas exploitation on public lands, no national grid upgrade, which I mentioned before, no energy efficiency, repeal of the IRA, promotion of liquefied natural gas, and no loan guarantees. And that's a big issue that I want to just spend a second on. Department of Energy has been hugely important to the creation and promotion of new technologies, including large-scale solar and batteries, battery storage of all forms, and a lot of other very important large-scale development that promotes renewable energy. So one of the major mechanisms to get investment of technologies that are sometimes on the cutting edge requires the government to support them, because oftentimes private capital doesn't want to take that level of risk. There are important government policies in promoting things like renewables, batteries, et cetera. And so loan guarantees are actually a very low-cost way for the government to support new technologies and cutting-edge efforts that then allows private capital to come into the market. So those are sometimes called public-private partnerships, or P3. That has been a very important part of what Department of Energy has done over the past couple of decades, and very, very successfully. So Project 2025 wants to end that, and that's reflected in the Trump budget. So, and then, of course, another aspect of Department of Energy is that they want to open up Alaska lands to more oil and gas exploration and drilling. And that is certainly a theme that we see. Now, I mentioned US EPA already. They clearly want to gut it. They want to move compliance assistance ahead of enforcement of environmental laws. That's actually a theme of most Republican administrations. The idea that you work with industries, with companies that violate environmental laws to get them into compliance. There's nothing wrong with that, but I can tell you, having done 25 years of environmental compliance at the California Attorney General's office, that without the enforcement piece of that, compliance falls very quickly. And I'm sure that we'll see that over the next few years. They also want to reduce pollution regulations through EPA. There's a proposal right now in the Trump administration to roll back controls on mercury emissions, one of the most impactful pollutants that we have. Very likely, and again, this is an area where you know more than I, but very likely to impact the health of many, many people near power plants. I mentioned data. I will continue that as a theme. EPA is no longer collecting data that is very essential to understanding the impacts on the environment. And then there's also a proposal, we'll see if this goes into effect, but so far it hasn't. This is one area that we haven't seen yet, that would preclude US EPA from taking action on new environmental threats and require that Congress first act. And we know the likelihood of Congress acting with any expediency. So quickly with Department of Interior, again, opening public lands to oil and gas, gutting the Endangered Species Act, and then opening Alaska as well. And then Department of Transportation, I just wanted to note that Project 2025's proposal is to end all funding, federal funding for transportation. I haven't looked at the budget on this issue, but I assume that in addition to ending the $4 billion for high-speed rail in California, that there will be a pretty big attack on funding under Department of Transportation for transit in the states. So let's see here. All right. So now I want to get into some of the specifics of Project 2025 that are in process, and talk about some of the implications and some of the legal issues that go along with it. The first one is around civil service and has gotten way less publicity than it should, and I think something that will have a profound effect well into the future. So in the first Trump administration, at the very end of that 4 years, Trump issued something called Schedule F. And this is a new proposal to make many portions of the civil service, instead of being a civil service merit process, to turn them into appointees. And so I'll come back to that in a second as to what that means and how it became problematic. So the Civil Service Act goes back to 1883. So it's been 150 years. And the reason for that is, not surprisingly, to stop what used to be called the spoils system, where people basically pay to play. They get important jobs by being friends of the president. So there's a trade-off here, and I'm not naive. I spent many years in a bureaucracy, primarily in the state government. Civil service is not always the easiest process to find your way through. It can be bureaucratic and slow and painful and annoying, but it also protects people and their jobs, and it really creates a professional class of public servants, and it limits the ability to create a spoil system. So in the federal government, there are actually 3,000 to 4,000 appointed positions. So quite a lot, but not overwhelming, given that the federal workforce is about 2 million people. So under Schedule F, that would change to hundreds of thousands. This is an absolutely massive impact, because a lot of the positions that would be turned into appointed positions are really mid-management, mid-level, high expertise. So the way they are defining it under Schedule F is that these positions have some impact on policy. And so the claim is that when you're implementing in any foreign policy, that is the presidential prerogative, and you should be an appointee of the president. So this can have potentially a huge impact, because it changes what the government looks like. And to be blunt, it will politicize many, many jobs that currently are public service jobs. So there is authority in the law for a president to create um, a new civil service strata, and that can be done if conditions for good administration warrant. That's the rule or the law. But there are limits to that authority. So OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, has rules, and actually the Biden administration, because they had seen Schedule F from the previous Trump administration, tightened the rules. So the, the first rule is that you can't transfer a protected employee with civil service protection to a non-protected position. And it also gives a definition of what is a policy position. So there's going to be a lot of litigation over this, but what the Trump administration has done through DOGE is basically to fire all of these sort of mid-level experts, mid-level management people, with the idea that they weren't going to be able to transfer them to appointed positions, so they simply got rid of them. Now, some of those firings are currently under litigation, and we'll see where it goes. But the idea is that once you clear that out, then you use this Schedule F approach and make them appointed positions, claiming that they're policy related. And then there'll be litigation over whether they really are policy related or not. And that could go on for quite a while. So we'll see. There also are rules about how you hire people, even if they're in an appointed position. And that takes a while. So I'm not sure they're going to be able to get to the place that they want. But the first thing they've done is to clear out a huge number of very important employees. And we'll see, I think, over the next few years, the impact of the inability of the government to do basic services. I think we're not there yet, but I think we will be. And it's going to take a very, very long time, assuming that the next administration doesn't support this approach, to replace the expertise that is currently being decimated. And it's hugely important. People don't understand that, and that's unfortunate, but the work that people in civil service positions do, I think I have a good feel for it, and it's incredibly important. We're going to miss it. All right, hit the wrong button. Okay, so moving right along, the next thing I want to talk about is the Antiquities Act. This is also an obscure law, but very important. It is the law that presidents use to create national monuments. As I note here on the slide, over the life of the Antiquities Act, which is well over 100 years, it's been used 300 times, and it has protected millions of acres under the rubric of declaring national monuments. It is set up to be a presidential authority created by Congress, but does not need congressional approval for the creation of monuments. And Obama and Biden used it quite extensively. Project 2025 and the Trump administration have strongly contended that both Obama and Biden have abused this law, although they don't say why, just that they don't like the monuments that have been created, many of them in the West, but not exclusively. So this is going to create a series of legal issues, because under the first Trump administration, he tried to redefine some of the national monuments that Obama had created to downsize them. Before there was any final ruling as to whether he had the authority to downsize monuments created by his predecessor, he was out of office, and Biden reversed the downsizing. So the question under the Antiquities Act is whether or not the president has the authority to downsize a monument determined and designated by any of the previous predecessor presidents. So let's see how we want to do this. So one of the arguments is going to be, does the Antiquities Act itself allow for the downsizing? There is nothing in the Antiquities Act that explicitly says you may downsize any previously determined monument. And so the first argument is going to be if Congress knew how to give that authority, they did not. Therefore, you cannot downsize. However, there are no court rulings to this point, so we don't know how this is going to come out. And I will say that there have been, over many years, 18 times that the size or the extent of a national monument has been changed later in time by a president. And the issue, the wording of the statute says monuments are to be confined to the smallest area compatible with proper care and management. So the question is that solely at the moment of creation of that monument, or does that continue to be an ongoing consideration for future presidents to evaluate on an ongoing basis? So we don't know the answer to that. It's going to be, I think, an interesting issue for this Supreme Court, because this Supreme Court believes and has written many, many opinions that says the first and most important thing is you look at the specific language of the statute. And here the specific language of the statute does not create authority to reduce the size of the monument. So if they're going to be doctrinally consistent, which we'll see, then I think the answer is pretty clear. If they issue a decision that says, oh yeah, no problem, you can change the size of a monument later in time, then I think the idea of consistency will be thrown out the window, which will not be the first time. I think it's by far the better legal argument that you cannot downsize, but that doesn't mean that that will be the outcome. All right. Moving right along. So the Congressional Review Act is a law that allows Congress to overturn final rules issued by federal agencies. It can only be done within 60 working days of the final rule. So once a rule is finalized, it goes through a whole rulemaking process, and there is, this is for formal rules. The agency makes a final determination. That rule is in place. Congress has 60 working days to make a determination as to whether it wants to overturn that rule. And it's a pretty draconian act, because if Congress determines, both the House and the Senate, and then signed by the president, if they overturn that rule, then no additional rule, no new rule can be issued that is substantially the same. Nobody knows what substantially the same means, but that's the law. So usually this occurs at the end of an administration into the next administration, because you need a presidential signature to make this happen. The other important point here is that once Congress acts and says the rule is invalid, that cannot be reviewed by any court. I'll come back to that because, of course, there's always potentially some nuance. It's also an interesting process because the consideration of overturning the rule gets fast-tracked in the Senate, and it's limited to 10 hours of debate. But it's important to note that you can only do one rule at a time. In other words, you cannot say, let's consider 15 rules all at once. We'll have 10 hours of debate and we'll vote them all. It has to be one at a time for 10 hours. I'll come back to that in a second as well. This is incredibly important right now because the House and the Senate, signed by Trump, just overturned 3 waivers of the Clean Air Act that California has been using to create its own rule that says that by 2035, we cannot sell internal combustion engines in California. I have to back up a step to explain some of this. But under the Clean Air Act, only the federal government can set regulations for emissions from automobile tailpipes. There's an important exception to that because California created its own Clean Air Act upon which the Federal Clean Air Act was based. And as a result of that, and because of the particular issues of smog and pollution in California, California was given authority under the Clean Air Act to create its own emission standards. The only state that can do that. Other states can choose between California's rule and the federal rule. But the only way California's rule goes into place is if US EPA grants the waiver. So, as I said, California issued some rules. They got a waiver from US EPA. And what the Senate did was to say that that waiver, that action by US EPA, was a rule subject to the Congressional Review Act. I'm sorry, this is a little complicated legally, but it's worth considering here for a second. So the parliamentarian of the Senate has the authority to evaluate what constitutes a rule for purposes of the Congressional Review Act. Only rules can be overturned through this process. The parliamentarian said, the waiver is not a rule. And if you think about it, a waiver by EPA, how could it possibly be a rule? So the parliamentarian of the Senate made the determination, but the Senate is not bound by that determination, and the Republicans in the Senate ignored that determination by the parliamentarian. They used some procedural maneuvering to get around it, and they voted under the Congressional Review Act as if the waivers were a rule. And then President Trump signed it, and that, in theory, means that the California waivers are invalid. So because under the Congressional Review Act, in theory, decisions to invalidate a rule are not subject to judicial review. You might think that this cannot go to court. However, the question is not whether the Senate action was invalid, was subject to review. The question is whether, in the first instance, the waiver itself was a rule, and if it's that question of whether it's a rule precedes whether the Congressional Review Act applies or not. And so, in my view, that is subject to judicial review. And of course, the state of California is suing, and we'll find out if I'm right. There's another interesting twist here, because the way you get a Senate fast track is with a vote of 30 senators. And then that requires the Senate to consider for 10 hours, as I noted, each individual rule. So one thing that could happen is 30 Democratic senators could vote and say that they believe that every individual executive order signed by Trump, or every piece of guidance issued by a Trump agency, or any rule issued in any way by an agency, is subject to the Congressional Review Act and 10 hours of debate, one at a time. So there is the ability for the Democrats to actually tie up the Senate forever. And I'm actually a little bit surprised that they're not doing so, and then having a negotiation over what the rules might be going forward on how this process should play out. And I am hopeful that at some point that tactic will come to the fore, and some of the actions by the Trump administration will be subject to this 30 votes rule that forces debate for 10 hours in the Senate. I'm thinking that that is a way forward here that gives the Democrats a little bit of power. All
So
right.
quick
Yeah.
quick clarification. So the House does not need to weigh in, only the Senate has to?
So the reason I'm focused on the Senate is that the House has different rules for the Congressional Review Act. They do not have a fast track because they don't need it. They can get that to the floor simply by the speaker making a determination that it needs to go to the floor. And they don't have an issue over filibuster waiver because there's no filibuster in the House.
Okay, so
So really,
the House had already decided the same
yeah,
thing.
the House voted first, and that
Okay.
went over to the Senate. So yeah, the House is kind of not hugely relevant to this discussion. All right. All right, this one I'll spend a little less, sorry, a little less time on. So one of the first things that the Trump administration did, that Trump did, consistent with Project 2025, is that he declared a national energy emergency on the basis that there was a need, that there was an energy crisis, that the grid is unreliable, and that this is a result of too much renewables. So you might take issue with all of that, but I think it's fair to say that in all likelihood, a court is not going to second guess a president on the declaration of an emergency itself. So even if it seems pretty outlandish to say that we have an energy crisis when it's pretty clear we don't. Um, that is not something a judge is likely to say, the president has exceeded his authority in making that determination. So, what can you do once this national emergency has been declared? And it's declared under, he declared it under an executive order, but it invokes something called the National Emergency Act. The National Emergency Act actually derives emergency powers from other statutes, just to make this as complex as possible. So the actions, the emergency actions taken pursuant to the declaration have to be reasonably related to the underlying statute that allows an emergency declaration. For example, you can issue an emergency declaration under the Endangered Species Act, but there are specific criteria in that act that have to be met in order to take a particular action under the emergency declaration. And those statutory requirements are much narrower. It tends to be a very complex set of evaluations. But what I want to say is that the individual actions are themselves subject to judicial review. So you might recall the building of the fence, the wall, that was done under emergency authority. It was challenged. For the most part, he was given the authority to build it, but not entirely. Biden tried to get emergency authority to do certain things. That was struck down. So the court does look in some detail at the particular actions that were being done and whether they meet the statutory criteria. So I could go on, but I think a couple of points sort of in conclusion, then we can do questions and chat. The Project 2025 clearly is driving much of the policy on environment that is being pursued by the Trump administration. And I started with the themes of climate denial and oil and gas. We see that repeatedly. And it's certainly not going to change until some people start losing elections because they're not paying attention to climate change and the impacts of oil and gas. Many of the Project 2025 proposals are being put into place already. We're going to do a report, hopefully in the next few weeks, looking at the specific environmental proposals of Project 2025, and we'll look at very specifically at what has been done in the Trump administration as compared to what was proposed in Project 2025. And we already know that the majority of them have been put into motion. And I won't say they've been put in place because we need to see how that plays out over time, but they've certainly been put into motion. It's a clear-cut blueprint for the action of the Trump administration. There's really no doubt about that. So I think I'll stop there, and if we have questions about this or some of the legal issues going on with the Trump administration, I'll be happy to try and answer.
Thank you, Ken Alex, for a wonderful presentation. I thought, very clear and focused examples of the Project 2025's impact on energy and environmental policies. If I could ask the first question, first sort of a statement that, it's clear that there's a lot of damage being done, and that there's going to be a lot of litigation. The federal judges are going to be pretty tied up for a long time on all this. I don't know what's going to do to the rest of the country's business. It's going to set it back quite a bit. I know COVID set things back, but this is going to probably beat that. Um, One of the ways that the cutting back, the clawing back of funds affected our organization is that we had just been named to have a $75,000 grant from the EPA in a project called Environmental Justice New England. And, for the past year, we've been hearing, oh, don't worry, the fund's already, approved. It's already, earmarked. It's already, the check's in the mail, whatever. Maybe it was deposited at Citibank, whatever. But then we heard no go. The money is not there anymore. After being told reassuredly, it's already, Congress authorized it. It's been dispersed, as it were, but not yet. So I don't know whether that's a potential. For example, we don't have the money to hire lawyers to go after it, but what would be the chance of getting back money that Congress had approved and was dispersed, as it were, and then clawed back?
Yeah, well, first of all, my sympathy, and I'm subject to some similar termination of funds, so I certainly share your distress. There are a series of lawsuits uh, that I think should have some relevance to your grants. And there's a decision this week or last week um, directing, it was actually a Reagan appointee, directing a number of grants, particularly related to environmental and not just environmental justice, but DEI, as it's called, particularly underserved communities. And the ruling, interestingly enough, the judge went way out of his way to say that he thought this was basically these decisions were race-based and racist, and that funding needs to be restored. So, of course, in the legal process, that's round one. It'll go at least to the Court of Appeals and may go to the Supreme Court. But I think there is certainly a reasonable chance that some or all of your funding could be restored without you taking specific legal action yourself. But I would, my suggestion would be to get in contact with the attorneys handling that case, and make sure they're aware of your grant, and that your grant may be subject to the rulings in that particular case.
Thank you. I could come up with more questions, but anybody else want to go first?
Yeah, actually, I
Oh,
do. Thank you very much for your incredibly informative presentation. I really do appreciate it. I was very intrigued by what you were saying about how about 30 senators could basically throw a monkey wrench in all of the works. Have you heard anything about whether this is something that they're cognizant of and considering it as a tactic?
Yes, is the answer. So when the waiver became subject to the Congressional Review Act, Schumer said, this is, you're using a nuclear option, you're really playing a dangerous game. My understanding is that he is very well aware of this approach. And I'm hopeful that he's being very strategic and not simply walking away from the idea. I don't know that, but I intend on finding out.
Yeah, it would be very interesting because I was like, that was the first thing I heard that said, yeah, the Democrats actually could wield some real
Yeah.
power to prevent things from happening. So far, we've been pretty much reliant on the courts, any kind of votes have just fallen by the wayside. So
I agree, and so I do know some folks who might be able to answer that question better than I, and I'm intending on finding out.
thank you very much. And again, thoroughly enjoyed your presentation.
Thanks.
So I have a couple questions here. One of the first things that happened when the administration came back into power was that they dropped out of the Paris Climate Agreement. And I read that Bloomberg's group formed a consortium to keep the membership active during this period of the administration. But if they keep the membership active by paying the dues, I guess, and yet all this damage has happened, uh, what can be done? I mean, what's the situation going to be? And I also wonder about your reference to claims. Somebody can make a claim that there's an energy crisis, but what is a claim? Can they just say there's an energy crisis, or do they have to document that?
So let me start with the UN. As you say, the US actually it takes a year to actually come out officially. You can say you're withdrawing, but it takes about a year. Which is not really relevant because the US is not following through, of course. So Bloomberg is actually funding, as I understand it, the climate assessment work that the US was funding a significant portion of. So that's going to continue. The absence of the US is no small thing, as you're noting, both because of its leadership historically and because it gives cover now that they're withdrawn for other countries to do less. So it's a big deal, and it's also, the amount of funding from the federal government working on climate in various aspects dwarfs all of the states combined in the US, even California, which spends quite a bit of money on it. So I don't want to underplay it. It's a big deal. Having said that, when we started, one of the first things we talked about, one of the questions was Schwarzenegger's comment about 70%. 70% of the activity reducing climate emissions is at the state and local level. That's true in the US and it's true around the world. It's also the case that China is actually now taking some amount of leadership and responsibility. And so that's at least beneficial. China's sort of industry around electric vehicles and batteries is going to swamp the rest of the world, including the US, which is kind of pathetic. We're making America great for the 19th century, not for the 21st. And so there are some aspects where I think there's continued optimism is reasonably appropriate with a pretty big grain of concern. Now, the second thing you asked, maybe I possibly wasn't clear about claims on emergency. So the president makes the declaration of an energy emergency, and then what he wants to do with that declaration is to open up. He's basically saying the energy emergency is the result of renewables, because renewables, the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, so they're creating havoc, all of which is untrue, but he's able to make that declaration, I think, without being subject to being overturned. His actions then are, and he's identified some of this in the Department of Interior, has tried to speed up leases of oil and gas and try to do things that promote fossil fuels. And he's going to try to do that with coal-fired power plants and things like that. So the claims that can be made are for those specific actions. So if he's trying to shortcut environmental review, or if he's trying to limit the ability of an Endangered Species Act claim to stop a power plant, or things like that, each of those specific actions where he's trying to use the emergency declaration to speed something through to promote fossil fuels, all of that is subject to legal review. And frankly, it's not going to speed up anything. It's going to, if anything, it'll slow it down.
And then my last question would be, some make the argument, our last speaker spoke about the developmental effect on children of wildfires. And
Yeah.
I've seen some people make the argument that the cases for children's rights are some of the potentially strongest cases for holding strong on environmental issues. Do you believe that there is merit in considering the strength of children's cases?
Well, I think emotionally, of course, that's true. I think legally, the way you win these cases is through. I'm a big fan of things like using the legal theory of public nuisance, and I think for that you would need to show, for example, wildfire smoke causing particular health impacts, and then you have to tie the wildfire smoke back to increased threat based on climate change. There are more direct ways to do it. I think sea level rise, flooding, some of those are more direct. There's currently litigation by the state of California against oil companies. That's just one. There are probably a dozen of those kinds of cases. I'm I handled some of the first nuisance litigation against coal-fired power plants that went to the U.S. Supreme Court. That actually got tossed out on a what we might call today a legal technicality. The new set of cases are under state law. The first set of cases were under federal law. And so I think that some of those are going to work. And I do think attorneys and plaintiffs like to have children as victims, if you will, because it's emotionally powerful. But I don't think that necessarily makes it a stronger case.
Thank you.
And I have one big last question, which is, I wonder whether you might agree with me that Project 2025 is real ambitious ideology, but it may not be great politics. In that, what about all the allies with us concerned about climate and energy and environment? What about businesses, and the clawing back of the IRA funds and maybe the BIA funds as well? What about farmers? What about the public-private partnerships? What about the military? The military is incredibly concerned about climate because they got to prepare for the future and they got to prepare for, action all around the globe. What about things, the favored funded projects like NASA? NASA incredibly needs good weather reports and things like that. I mean, and what about, things like you pointed out with the Energy Star, that's ideological stuff, but it's not smart politics, I don't think, when it comes right down to it. Tariffs is not smart politics. So is it going to be a lot more fractioning of the Trump support, like Musk, who said that the tariffs are crazy and the big beautiful bill is crazy? So what is the business it's money, and people in insurance agent business know about the danger of climate change and what's doing to their business. You know, that's front and center. What are the rest of the business community going to be saying about this?
Well, I have a few thoughts. One is Jerry Brown, who I used to work for, is very fond of saying that climate you can deny climate change all you want, but climate change doesn't care. Um, Having said that, you know, in 1970, the environmental movement became a big deal because the movement identified the quote unquote dirty dozen. You may remember that. I certainly do. And 7 of those 12 identified congressmen lost their election. And the environmental movement was very clever, whether it was true or not, in making its important, the environmental issue important to their loss. And I think we have not had anything like that moment with climate change, where people in elected office have clearly lost, at least in part, because of their position on not dealing with climate change. So I think we need to have that moment. I think 2026 may be a place where that could occur. You make the additional point that a lot of these policies are impacting and gouging and harming a lot of different interests, including business interests. I think that's true. The question is, will those impacts be perceptible quickly enough to start to turn things around? I think that a lot of government services people take for granted, and now they're going to be going away. So will they care about that? It sure looks like Medicaid is being gutted to the point where millions of people are going to lose health care. It's a hell of a price to pay, but as you say, is that good politics? I guess we're going to find out. And I hope that the answer is things are going to change, and maybe there's a response to this coming soon.
Well, from the healthcare perspective, Medicaid is going to also take down hospitals, especially rural hospitals. So even areas that, you know, don't think they depend on Medicaid because they're still going to lose their hospitals.
Exactly.
You can be a rich farmer in Kansas, but if your hospital is 200 miles away because everyone else has gone out of business, yeah, I guess you take your private plane to the hospital and those then.
Yeah, you're only one vote. Yeah, so I, you know, we'll see. I mean, it feels pretty awful that we're going to have to go through some major struggles here to turn this around, but it could happen as early as 2026, and that's what I tell all the people in their 20s around here in Berkeley who are pretty depressed.
Well, thank you again, Ken, for a wonderful talk and appreciate your work and your energy. And may it not flag because you got a couple of important years to keep chipping away at this. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, and best of luck with all you're doing.
Okay. Thanks again. Good night, everybody.
Good night.